Now, we built our proposal around 6 principles, and that's what I want to spend the vast majority of my time with you all talking about, because I hope you will think about these 6 principles, and then my hope is, as I describe kind of other plans that have come forward and may come forward, that you will think about those plans in light of these 6 principles, because we did get a supermajority of our commission to vote for it. As an example, we had 6 U.S. senators on our commission, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, and 5 of those senators voted for this plan. We got a majority of Republicans and a majority of the Democrats to vote yes for this plan. The first principle is we didn't want to do anything innately stupid. And in Washington, that's hard. You know, Hubert Humphrey once described Washington as 26 square miles surrounded by reality. You spend some time there, you'll believe it. But by that, what I mean is we didn't want to do anything that would disrupt what we believed is a very, very fragile economic recovery. Now, when we talked about the economic recovery being fragile in December of last year, people looked at us, you know, many people, and questioned us. They said, you know, the recovery's real. It's, you know, we're doing fine. You know, go make all the cuts you want to. And, you know, they said things like, you know, Erskine, don't worry about it. Factory production is up. Retail sales are up. Existing home sales are up. Banks are starting to lend to small businesses. Investor sentiment is up. Unemployment's coming down. And the recovery's real. And, you know, I too thought the recovery was real, but I believed it was very fragile. And the reason I believed it was very fragile goes back to your basic economics 101, which you all learned here at Chapel Hill. You know, if you think about it, you know, it all goes back to where is the demand going to come from? And, you know, the consumer is still 2/3 of GDP, and the consumer remains highly leveraged. And, you know, if you think about it, household debt is about $13 trillion. That's 120% of disposable income, and half of that household debt, you know, is floating, and the consumer is 2/3 of GDP. So if you think about it, you know, at least the way we did, being highly leveraged and the consumer probably being hesitant coming out of this recession, we were worried, would they really go out there and spend? And what happens if interest rates go up? If you think the rise in food and gas prices took a bite out of consumer demand, you get interest rates back to normal, and you'll really see consumer demand go in the tank. So we thought, you know, that growth may not come from the consumer. So that meant it had to come from one of 2 other sources. The second source we thought about was business. And, you know, small business can't grow and can't create jobs without money. And small businesses are having a really difficult time getting their hands on capital. And if you think about, you know, where the innovation to start new businesses have come in this country, it's come from these small businesses. And if you look at the data, new business starts have been declining in this country for over 30 years. And small businesses are getting strangled with regulation. So that left big business. And big business has got plenty of money, but their capital today is on strike because they're concerned. They don't have confidence. And until they have confidence that this government's going to stand up to its problems, they're not going to cut loose of those dollars. So we were worried that the growth would come from the business sector. And that left government. And Lord knows the government had done its part. You know, we had the big stimulus program, and we didn't believe that this Congress was going to support another big stimulus program. And if you look to state and local government, you don't have to look any further than Raleigh to see that state governments are cutting their budgets and laying people off. So we didn't see it coming from there. And it certainly wasn't going to come from Europe, and it wasn't going to come from Japan. And you know, in China, they're trying to slow their rate of growth, and they're in the process of going from a export-based economy to a consumption-based economy. So we were worried about demand. And when you're worried about demand, one of the things you want to do is make sure you don't do anything stupid to slow down the rate of growth of the country. And therefore, we didn't want to make big cuts in 2011 and 2012. We made cuts in 2011 and 12, but we made our big cuts in 2013 because we didn't want to disrupt a very fragile economic recovery. Now, lots of people said, Erskine, you can make those cuts in 2012. You know you can. And I said, you're right, but I don't want to bet the country on it. So we made big cuts in 2013 and got the spending of this country back to 2008 levels in real terms, pre-crisis levels. Second principle was we didn't want to do anything to hurt the truly disadvantaged. So if you look at our budget cuts, you won't see any cuts in the income support programs in things like food stamps or workers' comp or SSI. And we actually did some things that made our job more difficult if you were trying to reduce a deficit. On Social Security, we actually raised the minimum payment to 125% of poverty. And we gave everybody between 81 and 86 a 1% per year bump up in their payment because every Republican and Democratic economist that came to see us said that's when people need it the most. And yes, we are the guys that raised the eligibility age for Social Security. We raised it 1 year, 40 years from now. We wanted to give people a chance to get ready. You wouldn't believe the letters and emails I got on that. I mean, it's like unbelievable. I tell you, this Roosevelt guy was really a smart guy. You know, Roosevelt, when he created Social Security, you know, average life expectancy was 63, and you got Social Security at 65. Today, average life expectancy is like 78, 79. You get it at 62. There's a little wonder we have an arithmetic problem. But we didn't want to do anything to hurt the truly disadvantaged, and that's why we did not make cuts in those areas. The third principle was that we wanted to make sure this country was safe and secure. And I agree with Admiral Mullen, who is chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When asked what our biggest national security problem was, he didn't say these terrorists. He said it was this debt and these deficits, because they will consume every dollar of resource we have if we don't get them under control. So believing in shared sacrifice, we made cuts in the spending of our military. Today, we spend in the U.S. on national defense more than the next 14 largest countries combined. And that spending is hollowing out this country. I don't personally believe that America can afford or should be the world's policeman. I think we are bearing a disproportionate responsibility for global world peace. And so we made cuts in our defense budget. And to kind of show you how crazy it is today anyway, you know, we have this treaty with Taiwan that will protect them, you know, if they are invaded by the Chinese. The only problem is we'll have to borrow the money from the Chinese to do it. It's true. Our fourth principle goes back to something that Holden and the people who work for the university have heard me say a zillion times. I think the president was right, or at least half right, when he said in his State of the Union speech that America has to invest in education, in infrastructure, and high-value added research if we are going to be competitive in a global economy. But the part he left out is that we have to do it in a fiscally responsible manner. We live in a world of limited resources, and limited resources mean only one thing: choices, priorities. So look, I spent 6 years here at this university, and I wanted so badly to do our part here at the university, to do our part to improve K through 12. And I felt we had a real responsibility to do that because we produce most of the teachers. So I looked for every way we could improve teacher education. And the first place I looked was the federal government. And you know what I found? There are 82 programs to improve the quality of teacher education. Now, do we need 2 or 3 good ones? You bet. But we don't need 82. And I'll tell you something even more controversial. You know, we do about $1.5 billion worth of research here at the university. And we're proud of that. We've worked hard to get those research dollars. It's important to your education. But is every one of these research projects on our 17 campuses high value-added research? I dare say it's not. And today we're doing research on 3,000 college campuses throughout America. I think before we ask for new money to do federal research, we have a responsibility in this whole scheme of shared sacrifice to make sure that every dollar we spend is going for high value added research. You know, there was a great professor that Holden told me about who was a chemist, a Nobel Prize winning chemist. His name was Ernst Rutherford. And when Ernst Rutherford, when his Nobel project was running out of money, he turned to his team and said, "Hey, we're running out of money. Now we got to start thinking." Well, that's what America is. We're running out of money. And we got to start thinking. We got to spend the resources we have as wisely as possible if we're truly going to solve our nation's problems. The fifth principle deals with tax reform. We have the most ineffective, inefficient, anti-competitive tax system in the world. You couldn't dream up our tax system if you tried. Today we net in total tax revenue at the federal government on an annual basis $1.1 trillion. And people wonder, how can you net so little relatively when we have such relatively high tax rates? And the reason is we have $1.1 trillion of deductions and credits. And these deductions and credits are just spending by another name. And a lot of them are things that you all in this room really like. But I ask you to stop and think. What if we got rid of all of those deductions and credits? Many of it got in there just because some special interest had powers in Washington. If we got rid of all of those deductions and credits, and we used 92% of the money to reduce income tax rates, and 8% of the money to reduce the deficit, we could take individual rates to 8% up to $70,000, 14% up to $210,000, and have a maximum rate of 23%. And we could take the corporate rate to 26%, and we could go to a territorial system so that $1 trillion that's now captured overseas could be brought back to this country to create jobs over here. And I think if we did that, we would have dynamic growth and create jobs by the thousands here in this country. So I think we should reform the tax code. And lastly, our last principle is we just got to get serious about spending cuts. You know, the problems are real, the solutions are all painful, and there is no easy way out. And we've got to cut spending wherever we find it, whether it's in the tax code, or the defense budget, or the non-defense budget, or the entitlement programs. We got to be serious about tax cuts. And what went on in Washington during the first 4 months of this year, I think, was shameful. They ended up cutting $40 billion out of the budget. And that sounds like a big number. And that was $40 billion over 10 years. Well, you know, we're spending about $3.8 trillion a year. If we took that whole $40 billion out of this year, it'd only be a 1.1% cut. How would you like to have just a 1.1% cut? Holden could do it tomorrow. Every business person in this room could do it tomorrow. So we got to be serious. Our proposal cut the budget by $4 trillion. It reduced the deficit to GDP, to reduce the deficit by half by 2015 and by 3/4 by 2020. It reduced the deficit to GDP ratio to 2.3%. The president asked us to get to 3% by 2015 and down to 1.2% by 2020. And it took our debt to GDP ratio to 62% by 2020 and to 60%, which was our goal, by 2022, and eventually to balance. Now, since we came forward with that budget, there are 3 other budgets that have come out. The first one came out from Chairman Paul Ryan, the chairman of the House Budget Committee. And have any of you all met Paul Ryan? We should get him to come to the university. I'm telling you, this guy is amazing. I always thought I was okay with arithmetic. This guy can run circles around me. And he is honest, he is straightforward, he is sincere, and the budget he came forward with is just like Paul Ryan. It is a sensible, straightforward, honest, serious budget, and it cut the budget deficit just like we did by $4 trillion. Now, he got there in a different way than we did. He did 2 different things than we did, and that kind of affected everything else he did. The first thing Paul did was he decided he wouldn't cut the military budget at all, and in fact let it increase a little bit. And that was about $1 trillion he had to make up for in a 10-year period. Second thing he did was I took 92% of the proceeds from reducing the tax expenditures and used those to reduce rates. He took all of the money to reduce rates, and therefore he had another $100 billion a year that I was using to reduce the deficit to make up for, and that's a total of $2 trillion there that he had to make up for. And he got the money by cutting the income support programs and the non-defense discretionary budget by more than I would, and by making some changes in our health care program that are significant. The first change he made, first of all, he actually kept the cuts that were in the Affordable Health Care Plan that the Democrats passed. And then he said, well, look, I want to change the Medicaid program, and what I want to do is take that to a block grant program where I can block grant the funds to the states, and it's based on the theory that one size doesn't fit all, and that if the governors get their hands on this Medicaid money, they can cover more people at lower cost. And, you know, there is some truth to that theory. But what we felt in our commission was that, hey, that's a big part of the economy, and if we're going to change it, you know, we ought to test it first, just like you would in the business world. So we said, let's test that in 10 states and see if it works, see if the theory's right. And if it is right, then we'll look at it further. It's now being tested in Rhode Island, and it is doing pretty well. Washington State has asked for the right to do it, and I'd like to see it done in an urban state and a rural state and see if it works. But that was one of the things that Paul recommended. The second thing you're familiar with is on the Medicare program, he wanted to make that a premium support program, and what that is in basic English is he wanted to take it from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan. And that's what many, many businesses have done in the country. And the reason they've done it is it's very difficult to control your health care costs today. And health care costs are growing so fast, just like they are at the university, that they want to pass those cost increases along to the beneficiary as opposed to the corporation paying it. And that's what Paul wanted to do with our program. We thought that was a pretty radical change. And what we said is, look, let's test it. Let's test it in the federal employees health care plan, see if it works. And what we would rather do is we cut spending in the health care programs by about $450 billion. And our hope was that combined with the pilot projects that were in the Affordable Health Care Plan would reduce the rate of growth of health care to GDP plus 1. And if that occurred, then we wouldn't have to do something more drastic like Paul had recommended or something more drastic like a single payer plan. But if it doesn't, then you're going to have to look at these more drastic plans because we have to slow the rate of growth of health care. The president came out with his own plan, and the president, as you remember, came out with a budget, and I don't think anybody took that budget very seriously. The Senate voted against it 97-0. He therefore, after a lot of pressure from folks like me, he came out with a new budget framework, and in that new budget framework, he cut the budget deficit by $4 trillion over 12 years. And to be candid, this $4 trillion cut was very heavily back-end loaded. So if you looked at it on a 10-year basis and compared apples to apples, it really was about a $2.5 trillion cut. But he did set up some trigger mechanisms that could control the rate of growth in the budget. The third group that came out with their plan was what was called the Gang of Six, which was 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. They basically took our plan, put it in legislative language, and took it forward, and it has gotten a lot of support from Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Senate. So that brings us to where we are today. And, you know, we just went through this whole debt default scenario, which was a contrived, created crisis to say the least. I thought it was absolutely horrible. I've described it as pitiful. I thought it was embarrassing for the country. I think it caused the country, the whole process, to lose a lot of global respect. And I think you could see the results if you looked at the credit default swap market. The credit default swap market is where you go to find out what kind of premium you got to pay for insurance against a default on debt. Well, while this whole process was going forward, the premium you had to pay for insurance on the default of U.S. Treasuries, which were supposed to be a risk-free security, was more than the premium you had to pay on the default of the debt of Mexico or Philippines or Panama. I mean, this was really, really a mess. Now, if there's a ray of sunshine in this whole scenario we went through, I can tell you that at least it forced the Congress to act and to do something and to take a step in the right direction. And if I think about where we are today and I look at what was done, I look at it in 3 separate buckets. First, the process, second, the deal, and third, what the results are. I'll go through them quickly. The process, I thought, was terrible. I mean, absolutely horrible, and I think it hurt the country and hurt our global reputation a lot. And I guess, again, the ray of hope for me is maybe, you know, Churchill was right that Americans always get it right, but not until they've tried everything else. So hopefully, you know, we got it we'll eventually get this thing right. It's just the fact is we don't have a lot of time to get it right. Secondly, the deal itself is pretty easy to understand. It's in two parts. The first part is they cut the budget deficits by $900 billion, $350 from the defense budget, $550 from the non-defense budget. Some of that is interest costs that we won't have. And most of the individual items in those cuts were agreed to in those conferences that occurred between the Republicans and Democrats in Joe Biden's office. They haven't been publicly released, but I understand they are real and there are no gimmicks attached to them. The second part of it is this super committee it's composed of 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats, 3 members each from each party in the House and the Senate. And these 12 members of Congress are supposed to come together, and hopefully a majority of them, a simple majority, not a super majority, but a simple majority of them will agree on at least $1.5 trillion of additional cuts. Now, $1.5 trillion is, would be terrific, if they could do it. And the good part about it is it's at least $1.5 trillion. And it also means, so that means it could be more than $1.5 trillion. And in addition, there is no limit on the source of that income. It could come from either revenue, or it could come from cuts in entitlement programs or cuts in other areas of the budget. But if they don't get a majority vote for this by November 23rd, or if Congress in a straight up or down vote doesn't approve it by December 23rd, then $1.2 trillion of additional cuts will go forward across the board, $600 billion in the defense budget and $600 billion in the non-defense budget, but there cannot be any cuts in the income support programs or in Medicaid, Social Security, and if they're Medicare cuts, they're limited to 2%, which is about $10 billion a year, which is not enough to do anything to slow the rate of growth of health care costs. So what do I think of all this, where we are today? I am disappointed. I wanted the Congress to go big or to go home. I wanted us to do something bold. I wanted us to put our fiscal house in order. I wanted us to do $4 trillion worth of deficit cuts. I wanted to put the fiscal house in order for you all that are here today. But you know what? I'm an optimist. And, I think we can get there. I think these guys can actually do something big, something bold, and I think there's a chance that they will. And I think they will because I think the politics has improved. The polls show a majority of Republicans, a majority of Democrats, a majority of independents all want these guys to do something real. There are plenty of good ideas out there on the table. They're not starting from scratch. And they only have to get a simple majority to say yes, to make something happen, not a supermajority. But, I'm also a realist. And I know the Congress rarely does anything big or bold all at once. It's just not the way that Washington works. And if I think about what happened in 1996 when we balanced the budget, it really was a result of work that went on the previous 7 years under 2 different presidents and multiple Congresses. The problem is we don't have 7 years this time to get this job done. So what I hope is that people like you all can come together and work to get these members of Congress to put politics aside, to pull together rather than pull apart, to build our fiscal house out of bricks and not out of straw, and to really put this country with a strong fiscal foundation. I think if we do that, we can compete successfully with anybody in the world. And I think if we don't, we'll be a second-rate power before you know it. So what I want to do is ask you to help me. Let's work together. Let's do it for the country. Let's do it for our kids. Let's do it for our grandkids. Let's do it for us. Thank you very much.